Good afternoon. Today we're going to learn a little bit about ancient Egypt. As you may very well know, ancient Egypt is one of the most famous ancient civilizations we will talk about, and we are not going to spend a whole lot of time discussing this information. During this video, you need to make sure that you are filling in your notes guide and that you understand what is being shown to you on this PowerPoint. The first thing we should talk about is the Nile River. The Nile River was the lifeline of Egypt. In fact, Egypt is often called the gift of the Nile. Now, you should be prepared to explain why you think Egypt is often called the gift of the Nile. One reason may be because people just cannot live without water. Another reason may be for farming, for transportation, for food. There are many things that the Nile has always given to Egypt. In fact, Egypt would not be there if it was not for the Nile River. The Nile River flows over 1,000 miles, and it's one of 2 rivers in the world that flows north. The other river is the New River, which flows through my hometown back in Virginia. The Nile River flows into the Mediterranean Sea and was often worshipped as a god in ancient Egypt. They would have temples, offerings, holidays, calendars, all based around the Nile River. The calendars were not only religious calendars, but also agricultural calendars that would help people know when the rivers were going to flood. Here you see a map of ancient Egypt. You can see the green part in the northern part of the map. This green section is called the Delta. It is also known as the mouth of the river. This is a very fertile area. It's kind of marshy, almost like a swamp, where you have great farmland, all right, but it is actually subject to flooding as well. Now you can see in this map, you can see Giza, that's where the famous pyramids are. You see the port of Alexandria that is still used today. You see Memphis, which was a capital at one time, and the further south you go, you see the Valley of the Kings, which is where most of the pharaohs are buried in their tombs. Off to the right-hand side, you see the Red Sea. Now, something strange about Egypt. Because the Nile River flows north, where you see the green section is actually called Lower Egypt. The part where you see the word Abu Simbel at the very bottom, which is a famous temple, that is called Upper Egypt, because that is the upper part of the river. You have to remember the river flows north. Many of you know that the Egyptian government was controlled by pharaohs. They were part of dynasties, or families that ruled year after year after year. A father would die, the son would become the next pharaoh. He would die, his son, or another male member of the family. On rare occasions, you would have female queens or pharaohs, such as Hatshepsut, which is one of the ladies we will look at later on. Egyptian government was often called a theocracy, which is a word you need to know. This is a type of government where people believe that the ruler was actually a divine god on earth. In Egypt, the pharaoh was often the reincarnation of the sun god Ra. There are several very famous pharaohs from ancient Egypt. Probably the most famous, King Tut. Ramses the Great was also very famous. Ramses is best known for all of his building projects. Everything you see, or almost everything you see, was built by Ramses. King Tut was really only famous because of his tomb. As far as rulers went, he was not really important at all. Now, these pharaohs had power over everything: religion, daily life, war, everything. And you lived your life for that pharaoh, and you lived your life getting ready for the afterlife. When these first few pharaohs died, the huge pyramids that you still see today were built. However, these are basically neon signs saying, "Come rob me." It did not take long for these tombs to be looted by robbers and things to be sold off, including the bodies of these mummies. This is why pharaohs began to be buried in the Valley of the Kings. It is further south along the Nile River, and these tombs are built into the side of a mountain. They're very well hidden. However, inside of these tombs, they are very elaborate with many chambers and decorative hieroglyphics and engravings all over the walls and ceilings. What you see on the wall is actually called the Book of the Dead, which gives directions on how the Egyptian person could make it through the afterlife. Because of King Tut's tomb, we also know that they were buried with everything they would need in the afterlife, whether it's boats, food, slaves, couches, chairs. Everything would be buried with these people. Even everyday citizens like you and me could be mummified and buried in tombs if you had the money. Here is a picture of King Tut and his wife at ages 12 and 13. This is when he becomes the ruler. You can see his wife is affectionately touching him. You can also see the artistic work in this picture. I love this picture. It's on the back of King Tut's royal throne chair. You can see him and his wife. You can see that this is done in solid gold. The blue is called lapis lazuli, and you can see the artist's talent by the details of the rays of the sunlight. You can see the hats, you can see the hieroglyphics, the details of what they are wearing. This is a very beautiful piece of art that was on the back of his chair. Now, life in Egyptian society. We need to know the social status. At the very top, of course, will be the pharaoh or the king or queen. The second level will be the landowners, the priests who will have control over the religion, government officials. Third class would probably be you and me, everyday workers, the specialized workers that make daily life work. And at the bottom, you would have peasants and slaves and other unskilled laborers. Women did not have every right that the men had, but they had many of the same rights. They could not be priests, however, they could own property, they could propose marriage, and they could seek divorces. And they could actually, have people work for them and things like that. Okay, so these women had more rights in ancient Egypt than many countries in the Middle East today. Their religion, they are polytheistic. They believed in more than one god. In fact, they believed in hundreds of gods. They will build tombs with, like I told you earlier, with the directions of how to make it to the afterlife. If you made it to the afterlife or on your way to the afterlife, there would be a god that would weigh your heart. If your heart was light because you had lived a pure and good life, you would continue on to the afterlife. If you lived a bad life full of sin, your heart would be heavy with sin, and therefore you were not allowed to continue to the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that you basically had to live a good life in order to go to the afterlife. They mummified people. This is pretty famous, the mummification of people, and we will look at this a little later in more detail. And finally, their writing. Hopefully you know that hieroglyphics came from ancient Egypt. The words actually mean sacred carving. We will actually work with the hieroglyphics and do our own writing of hieroglyphics and translating. Hieroglyphics were not translated until around the year 1800 when Napoleon brought back the Rosetta Stone from Egypt. This allowed people to be able to read in Greek and therefore decipher the hieroglyphics. We will read an article about this later on in class. And finally, science and technology. They were very advanced people. They could actually perform surgery. They could set and fix broken bones. They could do heart surgery. They kept the calendar to keep track of the floods and the religious dates. They used geometry. Look at the pyramids. They developed a number system. The Egyptians really gave us a lot for society. In fact, Egypt is still one of those civilizations we look at today in complete awe of what they were able to accomplish. Now, eventually, over the years, guys, Egypt will decline, and they will have series of other civilizations attacking them because they were so famous and so powerful. You will have the Hittites, you will have the Hyksos, and other people invading Egypt over the years. Finally, after about 2,500 years, by the time the Romans are ready to take over Egypt, it is nothing more than a small piece of land, no longer an empire, and it will no longer be held by pharaohs once the Romans come in and take over.